Hello, everyone. My name is Gordon Kuhnfield. I'm an associate professor of communication at Villanova University in Philadelphia, and it is my pleasure and my honor to present my project, Mapping Vernacular Memory, the Logic of Assemblage in Urban Everyday Life, as part of the Urban Assemblage Conference sponsored by AMPS. So I want to start out by talking about a long-term fieldwork project that I've been engaged in the Kensington section of Philadelphia. So I want to talk about the subject of my fieldwork study using three kind of key organizing terms. The first of these terms is memory. And I mean this not in a personal, individual, kind of psychological or episodic sense, something that I do as a part of being a conscious kind of functioning human being, but something that we do, something that is always done together in concert with others, especially in the context of urban everyday life. The second concept that I want to talk about is the one that brings us all together. It's assemblage. I approach this through a kind of Deleuzian lens, and I want to explain a little bit about that, but without waxing too recondite. The third term that is important for me is mapping. And I mean it in both a figurative sense, where in the work of Deleuze and Guattari and A Thousand Plateaus, it is intimately connected with the concept of assemblage, but also in a literal sense as a cartographer, as someone who, though not very good at it, to be honest, nevertheless engages in a practice of trying to create maps as a way to both document and communicate the results of fieldwork inquiry to a range of people, especially to those who are the subject of that fieldwork. But rather than view these as three separate concepts, I want to bring them together, put them in dialogue, and explore those areas where they kind of connect and overlap. So let me start by maybe telling you some stories about some of the memorials I've found.
I was on my way to catch the L. That's the noisy silver dragon that screeches along the elevated tracks that cut through Kensington as they follow the Delaware River north. I turned north on Emerald Street, and just as I crossed the street in front of a corner store, I spot this small shrine hiding in the weeds. The shrine had been cobbled together out of scraps of lumber and what looked like a repurposed piece of furniture. Empty liquor bottles had been carefully placed inside the cabinet, and around the lip of the platform on which it rested, a menagerie of stuffed animals covered the top and tumbled down the sides. Their fur was matted by the rain and bleached by the sun. R.I.P. Bug had been scrawled in black Sharpie across the chest of a once bright blue koala. Almost invisible in the weeds, a small rectangular concrete pad had been poured in the dirt. Inside was a plastered heart, bejeweled by what looked like marbles and the remains of candles. There was a baby's footprint. The words, "In memory of Beau," a photograph of a young man in a Phillies jersey. I went my way, but I returned frequently on my walks through the neighborhood. I couldn't find any information on who Beau was, how he died, or who performed this work of memory here. Still, I was drawn back by wonder about this intensely personal, affective work that his friends and family enacted here on a public sidewalk. I started finding other similar public expressions of private emotions, and they took a surprising variety of forms. A mural on the side of a corner row house to Mickey, graffiti dedicated to the memory of a Philadelphia legend, Disco Duck, one of the original practitioners of modern graffiti writing. A park bench in front of another row home dedicated to Louise, a ghost bike to Antonio Sandoval, a worker who was killed in a hit-and-run accident. I had been writing about collective memory since the early 2000s, but the scholarship I was familiar with focused almost exclusively on what I call the three M's: museums, monuments, mass media. What little scholarly focus did exist on such memorials, as I was finding, tended to subsume them into a narrative dominated by those official, elite, monumental forms of public memory and the theories that inevitably lean in their direction. I was finding this cultural phenomenon, and it didn't figure into the work of the many famed cultural and arts institutions in Philadelphia, like Mural Arts Philadelphia and Monument Lab. It didn't fit into the media's representation of this neighborhood as ground zero for the gun epidemic, the drug epidemic, and the homeless epidemic in the United States.
So once COVID hit and we were all put under quarantine and the IRB ended my fieldwork, I started thinking about ways to take what I had and begin incorporating them into something. And thanks to support from my digital librarian, Erica Hayes, and a small grant, I was able to create an interactive website that features a map. And the map, in turn, presents the fieldwork data I was collecting in a way that allows me to communicate with the community and to preserve the traces of this field work. This brings me to the first of the three concepts whose interrelation I wanted to explore, and that is the concept of memory. Now, again, I don't mean memory in a personal or episodic sense. Such memory involve acts of recollection based on traces left in one's own experience. Rather, I am interested in collective memory, which, as Barbie Zellizer defines it, comprises recollections of the past determined and shaped by the group. She goes on to note that remembering is implicated in a range of other activities, including identity formation, power and authority, cultural forms, and social interaction. It is the being of the past in the present for groups, which is the basis, in other words, for identity and belonging. And as Mike Ball explains, in order for the memorial presence of the past to exist, it must be made present in what he termed acts of memory. These acts include things like monument making, which, as we have seen recently in the United States, involve not only sharing and discussing, annotating and collecting memory, but also negotiation and contestation. Memory, in this sense, acts of memory, serve as the basis not only for order and belonging and all of the sort of nostalgic markers of community feeling, but also of disorder and conflict. So I want to share with you a recent example that I found on a walk through my neighborhood just 2 days ago. In front of this corner store that was shut down by a combination of the pandemic and neighborhood gentrification, I found this memorial to a young man named Mikey. Now, I haven't had time yet to determine who Mikey was, how Mikey died, who Mikey's friends were, and why they engaged in this activity. But we can adduce a few things from this that are relevant to this conversation about memory as being collective. The first is that this was not the work of a single individual. This was a work of a group of people. In other words, it was collective. And we know this because there are different kinds of handwriting written in different kinds of markers on these candles. The second is that this activity was complex and probably ritualized, that it involved these people doing a lot of different actions, lighting candles, but also buying them, arranging them. These different elements that are here brought together, composed, and arranged with a view toward including or hailing in the public as they walk by on the street. These become material markers of acts of mourning, of remembering, of reflecting, and they are collective in nature. So it's tempting to see this as a thing when in fact what we're looking at is a flow of things and a set of relations created between them, which also serve as markers of yet other collective activities and actions. And I want to suggest that memory thought in this way, not as personal and private, but as collective and public, follows what Paulo de Assis calls the logic of assemblage. The logic of assemblage is focused on process over product. It privileges flow and movement and views fixity and stability as provisional. It is oriented toward the future and toward becoming rather than the being of the past in the present. Let me throw a graphic at you that might help explain this a little better. It's my attempt to map the constellation of concepts through which Deleuze and Guattari think this logic of assemblage. From a plane of eminence, which is that which has substance but without form, without a priori designation of the essence or meaning of a thing, or even its status as thing. All of this remains at this level indeterminate. On one side, a machinic assemblage organizes fluxes of content. It gives form to substance. And on the enunciative side, it assembles or organizes fluxes into forms of expression. And it's from these two sides, these two dual articulations, that assemblage emerges, not as an object, again, but as a set of mobile provisional relations between heterogeneous elements whose meaning, as such, is not determined in advance and irreducible to the terms. The relations among elements, among these heterogeneous elements constituting a body, are maintained or territorialized through recurrence and communication. And this relation among heterogeneous elements are mapped along two axes. Along the longitudinal, like a murmuration of starlings, things are constituted as a body through relations of movement and rest, speed and slowness. On the latitudinal axis, we see the capacity of this composite body, and these relations between heterogeneous elements taken together have the capacity to affect and be affected by their relations to still other bodies. So what makes a candle semiotic is not something inherent to the candle. It isn't even the act of writing words on it. It is the fact that this element is caught up in a process, first of machinic assemblage, which relates it to the arrangement of other material elements that constitute the thing, the shrine. And on the other side, a process of enunciative assemblage, which causes it to function in a semiotic manner. To assemble, then, is to borrow the elements and fragments from available milieus, assembling them to assure a value, as Deleuze and Guattari say. As properties or rhythms, they become meaningful. These memorials, in other words, are passional. They're not spontaneous or natural determinations. They are assembling an assembled desire. Memorials are processes, not things. Relations of recurrence and communication established between these elements, which are deterritorialized from elsewhere and otherwise, and made to function together, here and now, and give these affective capacities. The symbol of a heart written with votive candles, prayer candles turned into significant surfaces, a fuzzy toy bear, ribbons, flowers, arranged, affixed, here, territorializing this part of the sidewalk in front of this defunct store. Thereby, a place is constituted as a site of memory. And here we arrive at the last term, mapping. Ethnographically, mapping the city is a multi-sensory way of knowing. It implicates the body, both because it is through the body that we negotiate the imagined space of maps, and because as we move through urban spaces, we experience them at the scale of our sensing bodies. Again, not as pre-constituted things or essences, but as assemblages. And what better connection could we make here than this quote from Deleuze and Guattari, that becomings belong to geography? The destinies of assemblages start out or wind up in maps as orientations, directions, entries, and exits. Not only are memorials assemblages, not only is memory assembled, but mapping them is not simply a matter of tracing them as real things. It is also a work of assemblage. And through this work, sites of memory are connected. They are related. It causes them to resonate together, and it amplifies their affects. Mapped, located, and related, they produce a collective territorializing effect, a way of living place, and a way of placing life. But as Amen and Thrift emphasize, the city is a place of mobility, a place of flow and everyday practices. And the value they suggest in studying the urban and understanding the urban in this way compels us to not look at the container or the system, but rather look at the recurrent phenomenological patterns through which life is lived and through which the city is lived. This kind of city, the viscous city, is sometimes sticky and stuck, sometimes rapidly melting into rivulets that threaten to carry urban life away. Like old windows in old buildings, leaky and inefficient, pits and runs show that the glass is slowly dripping. This reminds me of Walter Benjamin's use of the term porosity to describe cities, and he uses it to explain the indeterminate character of urban life, the absence of spatial boundaries and divisions, one thing blurring into another. Urban assemblage, the activities of individuals and groups as they arrange living, is both the cause and the cure. Assemblage, in other words, is both responsible for the continuous deterritorialization of things as the city is constantly being decoded and recoded in novel, if provisional ways. It is also responsible for the re-territorialization of the city then, its continuous reinvention. So I want to wrap up by thanking AMPS and the University of Hertfordshire and the other sponsors for this event. I'm really grateful for the opportunity that you've created here and the platform that you've developed for these exchanges across disciplines around the question of urban assemblage. To those of you who have watched the video or read the paper, thank you for your time and attention. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to interacting with you however that looks in this post-pandemic moment. Thank you.